going to record the session. And so we are in actually, I think, our second session discussing Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism. And we are actually getting to the place where we're going to be talking about, we're actually in the midst of talking about spirituality in Judaism. And one of the things I emphasize, I think I even mentioned this last week, you know, in the world of spirituality, and again, 40,000 different Christian movements, I'm sure they have different perspectives. In the Christian world, spirituality is very much connected with a focus on Jesus and the life of Jesus and teachings of Jesus. In Judaism, spirituality, as you will see in a moment, begins with the study of sacred texts. So I'm going to go to share screen. And there we are. Okay, and I presume we can all see this, and I'm going to go to
small.
Yeah, I'm going to make it bigger. Oops. And now I need to.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Yeah. So Jewish spirituality begins with the study of sacred text. We looked at, I think, this slide, maybe the next one last time. The basic idea in Judaism, and we're going to go over this again and again and again and again, is that God has communicated with us through sacred scripture. And in Judaism, that's more than just the Hebrew Bible. It contains, I think, Neila, you and I discussed this. It also has to do with the Talmud and other later rabbinic writings. And so it's kind of the underlying idea is God communicated this to us. And since God's message and God's intellect and God's spirit is infinitely deep, the texts also must be infinitely deep. And not only, as you'll see in a moment, not only studying the sacred words, but even the shapes of the letters. And the letters, kind of like Roman numerals, have numerical values. So we study the numerical value of words. There is just, we do not leave a stone unturned in trying to learn deeper and deeper what God is trying to tell us in these texts. So that's kind of what I'm talking about right here. The presumption is that they are infinitely rich and infinitely deep. It's a love letter from God. And in Judaism, and I would say in most religions, scripture is closed. There's no more prophecy. So while we can have a relationship with God, we can talk to God, we can listen to God, no one is writing new books of the Bible. So we take the material that we have. Fortunately for us Jews, there's a lot of it. You can see all these books behind me. And we dig deeper and deeper and deeper into these texts. And it leads to mitzvot and connection and our actions in this world. And as I mentioned last time, Judaism is focused much more on this world than on the next world. I was literally at the bedside of someone who is dying today and talking with his family, and he really was not communicative, but his family was telling me that he really was not religious, although he was, very proud to be Jewish and connected to Judaism, not religious at all. And I got into one of my arguments with his family about whether or not he was religious. Because for me, being religious is about making this world a better world. And he was very active in those kinds of things. So that's the focus of Judaism. And now, because we're going through this material quite slowly, I have a bunch of texts to study with you. And I think this one we took a look at, and it's from a book called the Essential Kabbalah. Later on, I'll show it to you. I have it in my. It's a small book, but it's very good. So the first one is about stumbling, and the text reads, "Whoever delves into mysticism cannot help but stumble. As it is written, the stumbling block is in your hand. You cannot grasp these things unless you stumble over them." So this is a mystical text from the 12th century. And it quotes, so again, what the rabbis are doing is they're taking a quote from the Bible. So this one is from Isaiah 3:6, and then the Talmud is going to Talmud now, that would be 5th to 6th century Common Era, are going to say the stumbling block in your hand. One does not understand words of Torah unless one has stumbled over them. And then in the 12th century, they're going to continue discussing this. So if you find this confusing, you're in good company, certainly in company with me. I think I mentioned last time, I have about 130 books on this subject, and I've read most of them, and I still feel like I am struggling to make sense of this. If you don't find this confusing, either you're a genius or you're kidding yourself. So this is very difficult material, as we will see. But the correct thing to be doing is stumbling over it, is trying to work your way through it. And it's, don't think you're going to get it simply or quickly. Now, I actually have, yes.
Is that, the same thing when you are a researcher? You cannot go ahead and do something if you don't make a mistake. You always learn from the mistake.
I would say,
stumble.
I would say that certainly is part of it. And also, I would think it's a word that sort of helps me in realizing that this is not supposed to be easy and easy to understand, and it's okay to stumble and make mistakes. Yes, Les.
If we weren't stumbling, then we'd stop seeking if we had the answer. And don't they want us to keep seeking and trying to understand?
I would say that's the underlying idea in Judaism, that we're supposed to keep seeking and understanding. But no, not everything is difficult. Some things are not difficult. No, for example, simple differential integral calculus, that's not difficult. But when you get into, advanced exotic matrix calculus and line integrals and surface integrals, it gets a little more difficult. So yeah, obviously I'm kidding, but they're warning us that this is not easy. So this is now from Moses Cordero, 16th century. And I have some highlighting on this page. It's continuing on the next page. So anyway, I'm just going to read some of Cordero. Obviously, his name sounds very much like Spain. So this would probably be right after the expulsion from Spain. What should be your intention as you draw near this wisdom? Pursuing the straight path, dividing your time between Bible, Talmud, and this wisdom. I think when he says this wisdom, he's talking about Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. Partaking of each, learning this wisdom for its own sake, to enter its mysteries, to know your Creator, to attain a wondrous level of comprehension of the Torah, to pray in the presence of your Creator, and to unite the Blessed Holy One and Shekhinah by enacting the mitzvot. I'm going to pause there, and I don't remember if I don't have a lot of material on the Shekhinah, I should put it in. So this is an interesting subject. In the Bible, occasionally you will see reference to the Hebrew word Shekhinah. And Shekhinah is a feminine word. Words that end in ah, like Ne'ilah, is a feminine word. Torah is a feminine word. In Hebrew, things are either masculine or feminine. There's no gender neutral word. So, and in biblical Hebrew, Shekhinah means the presence of God. And we do see it in the Bible, but it's simply another word for the presence of God. The mystics take up this idea that it's a feminine word describing God, or a feminine name for God. And they get, I would say, they have, I'm trying to state this delicately, they have no trouble getting carried away with the idea of this being God's feminine aspect. Since the Torah says God made humanity in God's image, male and female, he created them. This is Genesis chapter 1, verses, I think, 26 and 27. Then God must also have male and female characteristics. And as you will see, we think of God in Kabbalistic terms in a tenfold way. And the Shekhinah in mystical literature is feminine and is even God's bride, and the feminine aspect of God. And you will, there are texts, I have to remember to include them if I haven't already. there are texts which actually get quite sexual in their description of God and the Shekhinah, and describe their marriage bed and how things were really fine. Hold on a second. When the temple stood, God's marriage bed with the Shekhinah was fine. And once the temple is destroyed, their home is destroyed, the Shekhinah is sent wandering with the Jews into exile. And so the ultimate goal of history, according to Judaism, is the redemption, the coming of the Messiah, the world to come. And one way that mystics think of this is right here. I'm pointing to it, to unite the Blessed Holy One and Shekhinah by enacting mitzvot. And we'll see, again, I think I have text on this, as a kind of a thought to get you in the right mood when you do various commandments, like putting on a prayer shawl or putting on tefillin or phylacteries. Part of the traditional words you say, I am doing this to unite God's name, Yud He and Vav He, and to unite God with his Shekhinah. So just like a child who feels comforted and more at peace with things when mom and dad are having a great relationship, Israel, it's God's child, feels better when God and his Shekhinah and all the aspects of God are in harmony and together. So that's actually a goal from a mystical point of view. You know, we say in one of the prayers, you know, in quoting, and we're going to get to this, Deuteronomy, I think 4:6, we say, "Hear, O Israel, Adonai, our God, Adonai, the Lord is one." So we say God is one. But then quoting from Zechariah, at the end of services, we sing, "Bayom hahu," on that day, Adonai yihye echad, ushemo echad. God will be one, and God's name will be one. So the prophet is talking kind of about sometime in the future, but it's saying it's only going to be on that day that God is one. So this idea of the unity of God is sort of a central mystical theme. Alan.
I want to just was reminded when you were talking about the feminine dimension of Kabbalah, in the knowing that this material was created in the Middle Ages, I believe, right?
Well, it depends what you mean by Middle Ages. So the Zohar is like 13th century Spain.
Okay.
I don't know if that's Middle Ages.
The time isn't so important, but the connection
that
we sing every Shabbat about Lecha Dodi, about welcoming the bride, having the image of a feminine holy experience. That's what I was thinking of.
Yeah, and Lecha Dodi is 15th or 16th century, a poem, and the image there is not only the feminine aspect of God and the feminine aspect of Shabbat. And so the idea is that Israel is anticipating his bride, Dodi's bride, with the same energy and the same enthusiasm and even eros as a bridegroom anticipates his bride on their wedding night. So there's a lot of sexuality going on here.
Yeah, Rabbi.
Yeah. Yes.
I remember that one of your lectures was quite some time ago. We read a beautiful poem about God and Shekinah.
Yes.
You had the poem, and it was a very explicit sexuality.
Yes.
In the poem.
And maybe we'll get to that again. Okay. So it says, so you're uniting God and his Shekhinah. This is a worship pleasing to God. Then you will walk the path safely. When you lie down, you will not fear. Faithfully, God will make you aware of aspects of the divine Torah that no one else has yet attained, for each soul has a unique portion in the Torah. Let me read a little bit, and then I'll comment on this. Try to learn from someone who has followed paths of integrity as far as possible, for the treasures of God have been entrusted in that person's hands. Do not chase after those who boast of their knowledge. Their voices roar like the waves of the sea, but they have only a few spoonfuls of wisdom. Many times I have experienced this myself. This has also befallen some authors who compose books with riddles, rhyme, and flowery language. Their words are encumbered by excess. We need not go into this. It is improper to cast aspersions on that which is holy. The books to which you should cleave in order to improve are the compositions of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, namely the various parts of the Zohar. We're going to spend a lot of time on the Zohar. So the Zohar is traditionally understood to be the writing of this Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in, I think, the 2nd or 3rd century, but scholars realize that it was written 1,000 years later. Of the books of his predecessors, Sefer Yetzirah and Sefer HaBahir, they just mentioned a couple of books. Cleave to them, these in love. You will then succeed in this wisdom, providing that you delve deeply and reflect intensively. Then you will discover most of what is found in the more recent commentaries, which you will no longer need. It is not our intention, God forbid, to declare these latter writers unfit, but rather to designate for the seeker the path that is short, although it is long. Pursue these books in 2 ways. First, go over the language of the text many times, taking notes to remember fluently. Do not delve deeply at first. Second, study with great concentration according to your ability. Even if it seems that you do not understand, do not stop, because God will faithfully help you discover hidden wisdom. As a parent trains a child, so does God purify one engaged in this wisdom little by little. I have experienced this innumerable times. If something in this wisdom seems doubtful to you, wait. As time passes, it will be revealed to you. The essential reward of this wisdom is derived from waiting for the secrets that will be revealed to you in the course of time. This is demonstrated in several passages of the Zohar. Often, something that has been doubtful to them for a long time would suddenly be seen anew. They had a saying for this: I have been pursuing this word all the days of my life. Those who persevere in this wisdom find that when they ponder these teachings many times, their knowledge grows within them, an increase of essence. The search always leads to something new. There is a wonderful image. I'm trying to see if there's a way that I can make myself seen while I'm doing this. I'm going to try this. I am going to do this. So does this change the way you see things? Just out of curiosity.
It's a share screen, a screen share, right?
So it's still a screen share, but do you see my image differently than
Yes.
before?
No, I
Yes,
see your
just
image in the
you.
very top left.
Okay, I'm going to try this and see what happens. One of the things, there's this image, and I think I may have a text on this, but it's sometimes described like a lover. And think of it in sort of, medieval Spain. So there's a woman who is up in her room, and she's wearing beautiful clothing, and she has a small window, and there are various drapes and shutters on the window. And someone comes by and looks at her and calls to her, and she might wave and give him a glimpse, and then he walks on. This person hasn't shown sufficient dedication to really understanding what's going on. But then someone else comes along, and he patiently stands there and woos her and spends time there. And so she parts the drapes, she opens the shutters, and then he sees her clothing. And then if he continues to pay sufficient attention to her, he sees beneath the outer garments. So what the rabbis will often say is the outer garments are the simple meanings of the Torah. So we have the story of the Garden of Eden. We have the story of Cain and Abel. We have lots of stories in the Bible. And, the rabbis say, don't think that that's the deeper meaning of the text. The rabbis say, we could write better stories than this. The stories are good, but, Stephen King writes pretty good stories himself also. We can write better stories. So those stories are really like the outer garments. And that if you really love Torah, and of course, Torah, feminine word, symbolized by the woman, then Torah reveals more and more to you if you're faithful and you keep coming back to her. So I love that idea that of this sort of wooing a woman is how we get to God and how we get to these sacred texts.
I think I like you had a much better explanation several years ago when you said that your wife made a beautiful Torah cover out of lace,
Yes.
and you prescribed that as you lifting the lace off of each parsha, it reveals itself more and more.
Oh, I like that. I didn't
I
say
think
Parsha because it never occurred to
no,
me,
no,
but I like
you,
it. So anyway, what the story Irwin is saying is mentioning is in Ojai, the congregation I served, uh, they asked they asked Sonia to make my wife Sonia to make a white Torah cover for the high holidays. Sonia is a natural mystic, but she doesn't know any of these texts in great detail. But she made a Torah cover of successive coverings of lace. And so I think it was exactly along these lines. Thank you for reminding me of that, Erwin. Okay, let's
yeah,
continue with texts. So, and some of you have seen me discuss this before, but it's a really good illustration. So, if you opened up a Torah scroll, the handwritten scroll in a synagogue, and open it up to the very beginning of the Torah, this is what you would see. And to read it in Hebrew, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, v'haaretz hayta tohu v'vohu v'chosha al pnei tachom, v'ruach Elohim mecharefet al pnei hamayim, and so on. So the interesting thing here is the Torah begins with this letter bet. And so one of the questions, I don't remember if I have it on the slide here, is why the letter bet? And we'll see an interesting story about this. But this is what it looks like. And there are crowns on the Torah, and certain letters are written in interesting ways. The chet is written in a very interesting way, sort of a mark of the individual calligrapher. Okay. So the first letter of the Bible is the Hebrew letter bet. So why does the letter begin with this text? And by the way, you know the word alphabet? A bet is the second letter of the alphabet in Hebrew and in Greek. In Hebrew, it's aleph bet. So one question is why begin with this letter bet? And one answer is look at the letter bet here. The opening is this direction, right? That's the only way this letter bet is open. You might ask the question, what happened before the Torah? Can't get there. Can't get through that letter bet to ask the question, what happened before the Torah? You might ask, what happens above the Torah? What happens below the Torah? Sorry, can't even ask that question. All knowledge goes in this direction, which is, of course, the direction of the text. So even the shape of the letter bet has a sort of a deeper meaning. And the other one, the other point is, and I think I mentioned this so often that I assume you've all heard me say this, but physicists also say that's true of the Big Bang, that you can't ask the question. Let me put it this way. The question, what happened before the Big Bang, is not a meaningful question because time begins with the Big Bang. So there's no meaning to the question, what happened before the Big Bang? There's no meaning to the question, what happened before the Torah? Also, the numerical value of bet is 2. Again, kind of like Roman numerals, each letter in Hebrew has a numerical value. Aleph, the first letter is 1. Bet, the second letter is 2. I think I have a discussion of that later in this, probably not today. So the letter bet is 2, and one of the explanations for the letter bet is that there are 2 Torahs, there are 2 revelations. And I think I mentioned to you Naila, when we spoke last week, that Judaism teaches that when Moses was on Mount Sinai, Moses got 2 revelations. One was the 5 books of Moses, which he was told to write down, and he did. And the second was an oral tradition never to be written down. And that's an essential element to understanding the Judaism of the last 2,000 years. And so one of the reasons why the Torah begins with the letter bet is to remind us of the number 2. So there
Yeah,
is a wonderful, sorry?
I just would like to say that if it would have begin with Aleph,
Yeah.
Aleph is silent,
Oh,
and
but it still could begin with Aleph. That's not a problem.
you wouldn't hear it. You wouldn't hear the Torah.
That's okay. That's
I'm sorry. They said, I heard from our teacher in Hebrew, they said before was another word that it was destroyed, and B is the second.
oh, that's interesting. I never heard that one.
Yeah, because whatever you say is regarding the rabbis in Spain and the West, but we had the things from the East, I mean Middle East. So maybe they are, I don't say they are conflict with each other, but
Right.
they are something else. They were saying that it is the second word that God made.
Okay. So it's a midrash I haven't heard, but I haven't read all those midrashim behind me. And there are lots of different midrashes. What's a midrash? A midrash is a rabbinic investigation into a text. And there are lots of different versions, and they sometimes conflict with each other, but that's okay. It's just like when we're studying Torah, different people will have different ideas about what the text means, and they may not be consistent, but that's okay. They're all insights. So I like that. So there's another midrash that that I love, but I never really looked up, and I have one slide on it. So the midrash is that before God wrote the Torah, all the letters of the alphabet, 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, were having an argument with each other and before God, because each one of those letters wanted the honor of starting the Torah. Okay? And I don't have all of the argument here, but here's a few of them. So the letter Shin said, I should be the one to start the Torah because my letter begins the word Shaddai, which is one of the names for God. It's kind of the God of the mountain or the omnipotent God. And but God responds, but Shin also begins the word Sheker, which means falsehood or lie. So Shin didn't get the honor. And then Reish says, I should get the honor because I begin the word Rachum, which if you know Yiddish, you know Rachmanis. It's loving kindness. But God says, yeah, but you also begin the word Ra, which means evil. And Kof says, well, I begin the word Kadosh, holiness. Shouldn't I have the honor of starting the Torah? And God says, yeah, but you also begin the word Kelilah, which means curse. And Pei says, I begin the word Redeemer, which is a name for God. But God says, yeah, but you also begin the word Pesha, sin. And Mem says, I begin the word Melech, but also Mehumah, confusion. Yud has a really good case because Yud is the first letter in God's actual name, Yud He Vav He, but also it refers to the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. Also Yetzer HaTov, Yetzer Tov, the good inclination. And Chet says, I begin the word Chanun, which means grace, God's grace, but also Chatat, which is sin. And then Bet comes along, and God says, you're the right one because you begin every blessing, every bracha. When we say, blessed are you, Adonai, that begins with the letter Bet. So Bet wins the argument. But in the Midrash, it actually goes through every letter of the Torah and imagines them having this argument before God. Okay. So another thing, and again, those of you that study with me have heard me say this and maybe even seen this slide before. And the reality is that we cannot simply translate the Torah. It's not that it's difficult, it's impossible. Because the first two words of the Bible, of the Torah, present a grammatical problem. The first two words of the Bible are Bereshit bara, and then Elohim is the word that means God. It's often translated as in the beginning, God created. The word bara is a verb, which means he created. But if we wanted to say in the beginning God created, we would say not Bereshit, we would say Barishona. Bereshit is actually half of an expression. It means when you combine two nouns in Hebrew, the word of in between the two words is understood. So if I wanted to say a cup of water, I would just say kos mayim, cup, water, and we understand the word of. Okay. And kos is the word for cup, mayim is the word for water, no problem. But if the first noun is feminine, we change the sound of the noun. So you know the word Torah, and if I wanted to say Torah of truth, I wouldn't say Torah emet, I would say Torat emet. The hey changes to a taf. So here we have Breshit. It means in the beginning of, but then according to the rules of grammar, it should be followed immediately by a noun. But there's no noun there. The second word of the Torah is not a noun, it's a verb. It's amazing to me that most Israelis I talk to whose Hebrew is much better than mine are so used to this opening phrase of the Bible that they never notice this. And I have some of the greatest discussions with Israelis about their own language and this phrase. So what's going on here? One possibility is that God is not very good at Hebrew grammar. I have great sympathy for this because I'm not very good at Hebrew grammar. And as my wife occasionally will remind me, I'm not even all that good at English grammar. But of course, the rabbis would never say that God is not good at Hebrew grammar. They would say, God is teaching us something. And what Rashi says, Rashi is the preeminent interpreter of the Bible around 11th century Common Era. Rashi was teaching us that we just can't translate, we have to interpret. And you discover this between word 1 and word 2. And my contribution to this insight is it's for those of us that have ADD and our attention wanders, God puts this lesson between word 1 and word 2 of the Torah so we don't miss it. So it's not so basically the Torah is screaming, actually what Rashi says, darsheni, interpret me. You can't simply translate. That's one of the reasons I love Hebrew. I think as those of you who have studied with me know that it's so rewarding to be able to study in Hebrew. Okay, any questions on that? That's I think it's an important point. So now we're going to look actually at this question of being made in God's image. So in Genesis 1:26, we read, V'yomer Elohim na'aseh Adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu. And God said, let us make humanity in our image, b'tzalmenu, after our likeness. Those of you who know a little Hebrew know the nu on the end of, I'll do it on the English, on salmenu, there's the nu, and here it is in the Hebrew, kidmutenu, there's a nu there, after our image. So what's going on here? Tzel can mean shadow as well as image. So one idea is that we are not only made in God's image, but in some sense, we are like God's shadow. And I'm going to talk more about that later on, I'm sure not tonight. So then the question is, well, let me skip to this bottom comment here. Why us and our and not me and my? So why does God say, let us make humankind in our image and not let me make humankind in my image? I'm going to talk more about that, but the traditional Jewish answer is God was speaking to the angels. The traditional Christian answer is God was speaking to his triune self, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But here's a question. This is an open question. I'll be interested in your comments on this. If the text teaches that we are created in God's image, what does that say about God? What do we learn from that? That's my question to you, if you'd like to comment on it. And there's no wrong answers here. These are open questions. And the best answers are the ones that no one ever thought of before. So the question is, what does that teach us about God? And what does that teach us about humanity? Alan, yeah.
Well, the term aspiration comes to mind, that as we learn about the wonderful things that God has done by creation and other things, God has also taught us to build a society around the concept of what God has created. And by using the we, it feels more inclusive. That God didn't say, shake his finger and say, you do this.
Okay. So there's a concept, I think in Latin, it's called imitatio Dei, to imitate God. And you hear certainly in the Christian world, people will say quite often, the question, what would Jesus do? So, but that actually doesn't get to the question I'm asking. If we're created in God's image, what does this say about the nature of God? And what does this say about the nature of humans?
Wow.
Oh,
I think it's very, very deep, and I don't know how to put it into words. But if you were ever a little kid looking at some clouds up in the sky, you'd see different forms up there.
Uh-huh.
It is blown by the wind.
Mm-hmm.
And the wind blows the clouds in different shapes and different sizes.
Yeah.
And you can tell yourself, gee, that looks something familiar to me. I feel something familiar looking at it. And you can
Okay,
see
so in what way are humans in the form of God and God is in the form of humans?
But I think
I-
that God means that the knowledge, like me, because God has a lot of knowledge, but gives some of them to the human, but not all of
Okay.
them.
Okay. Lex.
For me, interpreting in our image, I think it kind of makes us feel like we're part of God, that we have things in common, and it makes him approachable, where he's not the creator that is above everything and we can't come near him. We can't go close to him. I think it opens him up to us being able to approach him.
Yeah, so actually I like that. And the way I would say it is, just as we are entities that need to be in relationship with other people and other beings, so too does God need to be in relationship. That's my sort of amplifying on your
that's
thought.
good. I like that one.
Okay, Henry.
Yeah, the one that I've responded to before on when we've got into this discussion is about the idea of the shadow, and I like the shadow idea. But if we're like God's shadow, then we're maybe two dimensions, okay? And God is much more than that, much more than two dimensions. But at least we've got something in, where we're shadowing or imaging our perception, or what God is creating and instilling within us. But we're part of that. We're that image. We're the reflection, like a mirror, or but we're not the full dimensional aspect of
Yes.
God. But we do take on some aspect.
Yeah,
And
yeah, I like that. If you are standing next to a wall, or just on the floor, and you see your shadow is two-dimensional. But you, a three-dimensional person, are casting that two-dimensional shadow.
Right.
So
right.
if we are a three-dimensional entity, then that makes you wonder whether God is more dimensions. I won't even limit God to four dimensions. And you can start wondering about, what in the world does that mean? There is a wonderful book called Flatlands by Abbott that explores that question, but I won't get into that. So Naila, I see you have your hand up. You need to unmute. Naila, you have your hand up, but you're muted. I think maybe I can ask you.
There it goes. Okay.
Whoops. Yeah, there you go.
Thank
Okay.
you. So, from my perspective, just the basic Christian perspective is that the character of God just never needs any explanation. It just is. And it is perfect. His character is perfect. It is good and all those things. But in terms of relationship, or what it means to me as a human, is that there's always a need for me to want more, to seek more, to be more, because that part of me that seeks to be like God is just it's from birth. It's instilled. And so, but his nature is not necessarily something I can fully understand, but it's something I can fully appreciate. Therefore, I can strive to be that way.
Yeah, I would agree with you that we can't fully understand God, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and understand God.
Right. So you're always seeking to
Yes.
understand him.
Yes, I like that. Okay. Paul, Les, and then Erwin. Yeah.
Yes, I agree with Ela. That's how you pronounce your name.
Mhm.
I think we all, this is not what my feeling is. I think everyone alive has a part of God in them. There's something in there. There's a soul in there.
Mhm.
I also think that the soul is on all the time. All the time, God is in there, and God needs somebody. I would think God needs somebody to be his partner. He needs
Okay.
somebody to be his partner, and
Okay.
he wants God wants to be part of me, and God says, I say to myself, I see God inside of me. I see him in there. I
Okay.
see him in there, and what I need to understand is that God is needing somebody to be with him.
Yes, and we're getting very Kabbalistic, so that's good.
Yes.
Les.
If you consider the shadow, our shadow, always being there and only shows up when there's light,
Mhm.
then I would equate it that we're always with God. We're never away from him.
Yes. Oh, I'm going to build on that. I really like that. Erwin.
I think the reason God created us to his image because he wants to be very close amongst us. And that's where he said that build us a Mishkan so I can live amongst you.
Yes. In fact,
And
the
he
exact
doesn't
line
want
goes like
to
that.
have
You would think God
different.
would say, build me a tabernacle, a mishkan, so that I can live in it. But that's not what the text says. The text says, build me a tabernacle so I can dwell among you. So it's a way of connecting with us. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. Again, many of you have seen this from me before. The answer
Yeah.
I like as to why God says, let us make humanity in our image. Who is God talking to? I think he was talking to creation and to all the animals and everything that had been made before then. Namely, God is going to use DNA, is going to use evolution to create humanity. And therefore, we have divine natures and animal natures. Some of us are a little more in our animal nature. Some of us are a little more in our divine nature. And I see this actually as a biblical proof text for evolution. I don't know how widely shared that observation is. Okay, so now the question is, does God have an image? Does God have a physical image? Sorry?
Oh, we're not supposed to ever talk about God in a shul. We don't have any images of God in there. But
I didn't ask whether we have images of God in the shul.
Yeah, I know that.
Okay.
I know that, but I don't know. I've never really given thought to that.
Okay. Well, that's why we're here.
Yes,
Okay.
I've
So,
seen.
yes.
I would have. I have an idea of what he might look like, and the idea is a childish one.
Okay.
Like he's sitting in a big chair with a big beard.
Okay. So Zoom user, I can't quite remember.
I think God doesn't mean the image like us. It's a energy, because God says, I was that I was, I will be that I will be, and I am that I am. It is like energy that everywhere is and is the same. Maybe God wants to talk about the energy that we have to have good energy or bad energy or something like that.
Okay, you got to be careful when you talk to a physicist about energy, because I have a very clear image of what energy means in physics, And actually, it may even relate to this. We can't see the wind, but we can see what the wind does, right?
Yes.
We can't see light in a vacuum. We can only see light when it hits something. So you
Yes.
can argue there's a connection there.
Yeah, like we can't see the God, but we can see everything that he does.
Okay, Erwin?
Yeah, you know, but for example, we don't see God's hand, but when you are on an operating room table, most of the people say, pray to the God's hand should guide
Yeah, Erwin, we're losing your sound a little bit. I'm gonna Erwin, I'm gonna shut off your video because I can't hear you. So I don't know if it'll work, but
Okay.
Oh, I think that's better.
Okay.
Yeah, that's better. Okay.
Okay.
Henry.
So you can hear me?
Yeah, now I
Yes,
hear you
I
fine.
can hear you.
Yeah. Henry?
Yeah, the term God doesn't have any physical attributes like human beings, like we perceive, but it's a way that we describe things. It's what we're familiar with, and so we use those
Right.
those symbols to describe the actions and the attributes and so on of the nature of God. And yet we realize that God is not like us in the way that, like we have flesh and blood.
Yeah. Although
But
it does say, God
but
said, let us make humanity in our image. So
right.
therefore, you might think that's an image there. So
Yeah.
my point is, the Bible's portrayal of God is very anthropomorphic. It's very much like a person. God speaks, right? I mean, think about this. How many times does it say, "V'yidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor"? God spoke to Moses saying, well, if God speaks, actually, there's an article, one of the articles I came across, is what does that mean? That we say, oh, God doesn't have any physical image, but I don't have any problem with God speaking. It doesn't say that God appeared in a dream with Moses. It actually says God speaks to Moses. There's a couple of places where God is always described in English as getting angry. But the Hebrew idiom for God getting angry is God's nose gets red. God takes us out of Egypt with an outstretched arm, which is why we have the shank bone on our Passover Seder plate. So most of you are responding to what Maimonides said, which is the Jewish philosophers are saying, well, these are just figures of speech. Some of you said this, that this is just a figure of speech, that the Torah, when Maimonides very famously said, the Torah speaks in the language of people, therefore we have these images, but that doesn't really mean that God has any kind of physical image. So that's the Jewish philosophers. In fact, they go overboard. One of my favorite sort of commentaries by Maimonides on this subject is Maimonides has a very interesting comment, which sounds strange in the English until you understand what he meant by it. Maimonides said, you can't say anything positive about God. You can only make negative statements about God. Now, what in the world does that mean? What Maimonides said was, you might say God is strong, right? That would be a thing people might say. But whatever your image of strong is in your mind, that is blasphemously weak compared to God's actual strength. So any affirmative statement that you make about God, God is good, God is strong, God is loving, God is so on, you have an image there, but God is so much greater than all those images that you're actually committing blasphemy. This is Maimonides. Maimonides said you can say God is not weak. That's a negative statement about God, which certainly can be true. So Maimonides goes overboard saying God is purely spiritual. I mean, he likes the idea of God as a philosophical entity. So, and that basically he gets that idea out of Islam, because this idea is fairly late in Jewish tradition, and this is only like 1,000 years ago. So Maimonides is a Jewish philosopher trying to keep up with the Muslim philosophers and coming up with philosophical understandings of God, and he gets this idea out of Islam. And I'll make one more comment and I'll call on Henry. The Kabbalists will go overboard in the opposite direction. And instead of just having one or two images of God, they're going to have hundreds of images of God. Erwin.
Yeah, I don't know if any one of you been in a Sistine Chapel, but before I went to the Sistine Chapel, I had an image how I think God looked like, and when I looked at the painting on the wall, I said to myself, "This is how I imaged that he looks like."
Okay,
and
so there's.
what?
Sorry.
Other people must have had the same feeling when they were looking up, and then they said, "Well, this is how I think he looks like."
Well, certainly
Pointing
Michelangelo
the
had
finger.
that. Yes.
Yeah.
So the
Pointing
creation
the
of Adam.
finger. Exactly.
And there, God is very human-like. So I'll just maybe do one or two more slides. You might get a kick out of these. So here is a text from the same book, The Essential Kabbalah, from a text which I've had a lot of trouble tracking down, called Shiur Koma in the 6th century, where this is a Kabbalistic text that actually gives physical measurements to the size of God's body. I need to find someone who is a good artist who would draw this to scale. So God's feet are 105 million miles. The distance from God's ankle to God's knees is 665 million miles. God's neck size is 455 million miles. The circumference of God's head, it's a lot bigger, is more than 10.5 billion miles. The length of God's beard is there. Each finger has a length, 105 million miles. And the black part of God's eye is 40,250 miles. Don't ask me how they know this. I don't have the foggiest idea. And the only quotes that I've been able to find on Shiur Koma, I'll read this and then I think, I think this will be a good place to stop. So this is, I don't expect you to get anything out of this, but it'll just give you a sense of some of these texts. The name of his right knee, and there's a name, I'm not going to try and pronounce it. If it was Hebrew, I might be able to at least take a shot of pronouncing it. And the name of his left knee is this. The name of his right thigh is this. His left thigh is that. From his thighs to his neck is 240 million parasangs. And somewhere I came across, I think it was in Danny Matt's commentary, the conversion from parasang. You won't find this on your advanced calculator, the conversion from a parasang to a mile. Parasang is probably a Babylonian number system. And the innermost part of his loins are, I wish it was in Hebrew because I can connect it to meaning. A shining face, a handsome body, the fear of others, a good reputation, peaceful dreams, a good memory for Torah, prosperity in this world, entree into the next, forgiveness for the sins of one's youth, freedom from evil inclinations, and safety from all sorts of demons, wild beasts, and scorpions. I guess this is involved with studying God. His body resembles a bow, like a bow and an arrow, or the rainbow, and the bow is something like the semblance of fire forming a house around it. Between one lightning bolt and another is the gateway of Chashmal. Chashmal actually is like fire from heaven, and it's the modern Hebrew word for electricity, which is kind of interesting. And above all are spirits and thunderbolts, thunderclaps and lightning bolts, and the folds of the rainbow and the ropes of the divine seal ascending and descending it, and the throne of glory is glistening. So this is just one indication of how the Kabbalists are going to go overboard. I'm going to stop sharing. Are going to go overboard. I mean, how do we connect with the idea of God? Somebody had a comment. I don't know what it is. Oh, parasang. There it is from Cheryl. Thank you, Cheryl, the mistress of Google. A historical Iranian unit of walking distance, which varied according to terrain and speed, like 3 or 3.5 miles. I have no idea if that's the number that I used when I converted. I think. Oh, so the book that I was talking about is this. This is Kabbalah, The Essential Kabbalah, The Heart of Jewish Mysteries by Daniel Matt. Very small book. And basically, it's it's just a lot of, quotes. And the thing that makes it a little awkward is if you really want to understand what in the world is going on, the footnotes are in the back. So there's a lot of jumping back and forth in this book. I once studied this book with a very serious Christian and a Buddhist scholar. And the interesting thing was that the mystical explanations and understanding in Buddhism and Judaism are very close. And I've actually studied with Daniel Matt, and he said he feels much more comfortable and at home with mystics from other religion than he does necessarily with other Jews. So it's, as Jews tend to be hyper rationalistic, particularly Reform and conservative Jews. So I hope that whetted your appetite. We're going to continue diving into all these mystical meanings of text, starting with the Shema next week. Alan.
You prompted me by your making the rational comment about conservative reform. How would Hasidic or Chabad Jews relate to this same subject that you're comparing?
Chabad is immersed in Kabbalah and mysticism.
Okay.
So I would say Chabad will go overboard in the direction of mysticism.
Okay.
And if I have questions about mysticism, my go-to guy would be my local Chabad rabbi, because they are really very knowledgeable, and Chabad is very affected by mysticism.
A lot of the modern Orthodox people I know, which is a huge number, tend to be more rational and analytic, like I am, in that way.
Yeah. So this was sort of a great. I'm just going to click on Cheryl's link, and I'll come back to you. I don't know if I found that one myself. Someday, well, maybe if I see you in a couple of weeks, Cheryl, I will ask for your secrets of Googling. So there is in I would say in the 1700s and the 1800s, there was a movement called, and I don't know if I can pronounce the German, Wissenschaft de Judaism or something like that, but it's the science of Judaism. So it's a logical, rational understanding of Judaism. And I would say, and I think what becomes modern Orthodox is vaguely embarrassed by Kabbalah. Certainly that's true I would say in the conservative and Orthodox, as conservative and Reform movements. I have on my bookshelf somewhere up there, it's actually a very old copy of the sort of the history of Judaism, and it's like in 5 or 6 volumes. And I think there's like one small paragraph that's devoted to Kabbalah in all of it. And I think I quoted this statement by it's probably the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which was which is the main conservative seminary, talking about the work of Gershom Scholem, who said that basically Kabbalah is Narishkeit, which is a Yiddish word meaning nonsense. He said the study of Kabbalah is scholarship. So this guy appreciated the scholarly work of Gershom Scholem, because I think he was a scholar at JTS. So he appreciated the study, and Gershom Scholem's books are not easy to read. In fact, there aren't that many books on Kabbalah that are easy to read. But yeah, so I would say a lot of Judaism pretends to ignore Kabbalistic influences, but they creep their way into Jewish practice. So, a very simple classic one is Lecha Dodi, which is, it's just a mystical poem. Another one is when we wear a prayer shawl, those knots are tied in a very specific way. As you'll see, I think I have a slide on this. There's probably about 15 or 16 different ways to tie them, other than the one that almost all of us use. But they're in a very specific way, which is Kabbalistic in origin. So a lot of Judaism that we think is not so much connected to Kabbalah is very much connected to Kabbalah. Henry.
Isn't the Shabbos Bride that Kabbalistic?
Yeah, that's actually in that poem that we sing on Friday night, Lecha Dodi.
All right.
Yep. Okay, so thank you all for coming. and I will get Naila. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you Thursday.
Now, did you get me? I am Farah Monenpur. That yesterday I.
Yes. I sent you, and you should be on my email. Are you getting my regular Monday emails that I send out Sunday? And
yes, usually.
Okay, good. Okay, good. I'm glad we're connected. Okay, so take care, stay well.
Thank
And
you.
Wednesday night,
Thank you
we're
so
gonna
much.
I can't remember what we're discussing. Oh, Wednesday night we're discussing this question of redeeming hostages.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
You got,
And in fact,
that podcast I sent you, right, Rabbi?
Yeah, I heard it was interesting. And then someone sent me an article, I think from the Times of Israel, by a guy named Sherwin Pomerantz. I don't know if you've come across him as an author, but the interesting thing about him is I worked with him at one of the Israeli companies I worked with. And I told him I was going to be in town, and maybe I will connect with him when I'm in Israel.
The podcast that I sent you is focused on the contemporary problem.
Yes.
Not the Talmudic. It ties to it a little bit, but it's just so you know.
Oh, it focused on how many examples there are now of, of this problem of basically how many convicted Hamas terrorists do we release to get one Israeli released as a hostage, and sometimes even the body of an Israeli will release dozens and even more people from prison to get a body recovered. And it's a heartbreaking thing to contemplate, and a lot of people are writing about it. And of course, what this article does is it focuses both on the contemporary situation, but also on the original Talmudic idea, because hostages was a serious thing throughout Jewish history, and there's a lot written about it.
There's nothing that, if I could just add, there was nothing I had learned in the past about the problem of trading people. Well, first of all, trading people for bigger numbers of the person you're trading is something relatively new.
Yes.
I understood the podcast, but the part that is very heartbreaking is the kinds of people who actually murdered people who are in prison, and then they do it again. Now, this percentage is not huge. Of the couple thousand people released since October 7th, there are some murderers who, but the statistics are not automatically high. It's just the whole idea that somebody is
the article and the Talmud, I think it's even in the Mishnah, raises the question, what price is too high to pay?
Right.
And you can think of, I think when the Mishnah was written, they were talking about the price in terms of currency or goods or shekels of silver. But now the price is in trading lives. And there is a discussion in the Mishnah that it's not okay to pay too much, because it encourages people to do it again. Exactly. So it's interesting how, this text, which is certainly 1,800 years old, is reflecting this discussion. Okay, so we'll see you then, and take care and stay well.
Thank you so much.
Amazing.
You're welcome.
Amazing.